Nia had always been gentle, her heart soft even in the harshest moments. Born into a family that seemed to measure love by obedience, she grew up with the weight of expectation pressing down on her slender shoulders. From dawn, she was tasked with duties that no child should bear alone: fetching water from the distant well, sweeping floors that had never known cleanliness, and tending to the endless chores of a household ruled by cruelty rather than care. Yet even in the face of relentless demands, she carried herself with an unspoken grace, a quiet dignity that seemed impervious to the sharp words and harsh glares thrown her way. Her stepmother, a woman whose eyes could chill the warmth from a room, took particular delight in reminding Nia of her place. Before every meal, Nia was forced to kneel on the cold, hard floor and lick the dust that had accumulated through neglect and time. It was not just a test of obedience, it was a ritual meant to humble, to crush the spirit, and to entertain those who thrived on the suffering of others. The dust was fine and gritty, a blend of soil, ash and centuries of abandoned corners, yet Nia endured it. She lowered her head, pressed her tongue to the earth, and swallowed the taste of humiliation. Her body quivered from hunger and indignity, but her spirit remained intact, bolstered by an inner sense that she was more than the sum of their cruelty. Every morning as the sun crept over the horizon, casting a pale gold across the yard, Nia began her routine. She swept the floors, scrubbed the stone steps, and tended to the animals, each motion executed with careful precision. Her small hands, often cracked and raw from labor, moved deftly, almost rhythmically, as if the repetition was a meditation that helped her endure. She sang softly to herself, barely audible, a song learned from her mother before she passed away. The melodies carried memories of gentleness, of care, and of a world where her value was not measured by servitude or suffering. Despite the weight of her duties, Nia observed the world around her with a keen eye. She noticed the subtle shifts in the household, the way the servants whispered when her stepmother's wrath was near, the small acts of rebellion that went unnoticed, and the silent kindnesses offered by those who recognized her quiet strength. These observations were her lifeline, her small acts of connection that reminded her she was not alone, even when the world seemed determined to crush her. The ritual of licking the dust was particularly humiliating. She would kneel on the uneven floor, grit pressing into her knees, and press her lips to the ground, tasting the coarse mixture that had settled there. The elders of the household, and sometimes visiting villagers, would watch with grim satisfaction, whispering and laughing at her compliance. Yet in those moments, Nia closed her eyes, drawing upon memories and small acts of defiance that no one could see. She imagined herself walking in sunlight, her bare feet touching grass instead of dust, free and unbowed. Each swallow of humiliation was coupled with a silent promise. One day she would rise and her spirit would remain unbroken. Food, when it came, was sparse and simple. She ate quickly, often while still on her knees, tasting the crumbs alongside the lingering dust, and then returned to her duties without complaint. The world around her seemed harsh and unyielding, but within her chest beat a heart full of patience, courage, and a deep understanding that strength could exist even in the humblest of forms. Her body was tested daily, yet it was her mind and heart that she shielded most fiercely, cultivating a quiet resilience that seemed almost otherworldly in its calm determination. Nia's interactions with others were cautious yet genuine. She offered smiles to the younger children who lived in fear, shared small morsels of kindness with those who needed it, and held herself to a standard of integrity that no cruelty could tarnish. Her silence was not submission but a conscious choice, a way of preserving the dignity that the world tried to strip from her. Each act of endurance became a thread in a growing tapestry of inner strength, binding her to a power she had not yet fully realized but which pulsed quietly, like embers waiting for wind. Even the household animals seemed to sense her gentleness. Cats brushed against her legs without fear, chickens lingered in her presence, and even the horses appeared calmer when she approached. These small, almost invisible signs reinforced her belief that there was balance in the world and that her suffering did not go unnoticed. It was a reminder that even in a life filled with harshness, beauty and grace could survive, nurtured by intention and spirit. As days turned into weeks, the pattern of Nia's life remained constant, yet beneath the surface, something began to stir. The dust she licked, the humiliation she endured, and the resilience she cultivated were all part of a subtle, growing force. Each act of obedience combined with silent defiance fed a strength that no cruelty could diminish. Her spirit was like tempered steel, forged in hardship, gaining resilience with every trial. Though no one saw it yet, even the harshest eyes could not diminish the glow of a soul that remained steadfast against injustice. Nia's story, though marked by suffering, was equally defined by patience and courage. She had learned to find power in endurance, dignity in compliance, and hope in the smallest gestures of kindness. Each day, as she knelt and tasted dust before her meal, she reminded herself that true strength was unseen. It lived in the heart, grew in silence, and waited for the moment when it could rise, unbowed, to claim its rightful place. Her life, though humble and filled with hardship, was a testament to the quiet power of resilience, the endurance of spirit, and the unbreakable essence of a heart that refused to yield. Nia's existence in the household was more than servitude, it was a lesson in fortitude. Every task, every humiliation, every stolen glance of kindness became a note in a symphony of resilience. And while the world might see only a girl forced to lick dust, the truth was far greater. A spirit was growing within her, one that no cruelty could contain, one that would, in time, resonate far beyond the walls of her small, oppressive world. Each morning, as Nia lowered herself to the ground and pressed her lips against the coarse, gritty dust, a subtle shift in the air seemed to stir around her. At first, she thought it was merely the quiet of the house, the hushed movements of servants, or the faint rustling of leaves outside. But gradually she began to sense something unusual, something that pulsed and breathed with a presence she could not see yet somehow felt. This dust, which the household intended solely as a tool of humiliation, harbored a hidden essence, a spiritual force that observed her every gesture, every act of endurance. The realization dawned on her one early morning when, as she licked the dust with its usual grim determination, she felt a warmth unlike anything the coarse particles should have carried. It was gentle, almost comforting, and yet it resonated with a depth that seemed to reach into her very soul. Her initial fear, born from years of subjugation, gave way to a quiet curiosity. Perhaps this dust was more than a simple instrument of shame. Perhaps it was alive in a way that the human eye could not discern. As days passed, Nia noticed subtle responses from the dust. When she endured insults and jeers without complaint, the grains seemed to shimmer faintly, reflecting an invisible light that she could sense rather than see. When she faltered, allowing despair to brush against her heart, the dust seemed to settle heavier, pressing down as if reminding her that even suffering carries lessons. Slowly, she came to understand that this spiritual presence was attentive, aware of her patience, humility, and resilience, silently acknowledging her unwavering dignity. The dust, she realized, was not passive. It had a memory of its own, recording each act of endurance, each flicker of courage in the face of cruelty. When Nia's mind wandered to her mother's teachings, the dust seemed to respond, as if drawing strength from her hope and faith. It was as though an unseen observer measured her spirit, silently weighing her character against the harshness imposed by her oppressors. For every mockery she endured without yielding, for every act of quiet defiance, the dust absorbed and reflected her inner fortitude, transforming her humiliation into a conduit of spiritual observation. Over time, Nia began to feel a subtle communication, a language without words, a presence that resonated in her bones and heart. The dust's energy seemed to pulse in tandem with her emotions, a gentle vibration when she found small joys, a steady hum during moments of prayer or reflection. It was as though she had discovered a silent ally hidden beneath layers of grit and degradation. The very tool meant to diminish her had become a mirror, reflecting her courage back at her in a form both mystical and profound. At first she questioned her own perceptions. Was she imagining it, the fatigue and hunger twisting her senses? But the moments of clarity became too frequent to dismiss as hallucination. One evening, as the moonlight streamed through the cracked window of the room where she licked the dust, she saw a faint glimmer across the surface, like the soft shimmer of starlight trapped in tiny grains. Her heart leapt with cautious wonder. This dust, the very thing meant to degrade her, carried a spiritual essence observing her suffering, almost as if it were preparing her for something far greater than her present trials. The realization transformed the way she approached each morning ritual. She no longer saw the act of licking dust solely as a degrading punishment. It became a moment of communion with a hidden presence that watched, learned, and acknowledged her quiet endurance. Each grain of dust became sacred in its own right, a testament to patience, humility, and the resilience of the human spirit under oppressive forces. Nia's lips, pressed to the coarse earth, were now instruments of silent dialogue with something far beyond the household's cruelty. The dust's presence also seemed to teach her. She noticed patterns, subtle responses, and an almost protective energy that made her feel less vulnerable to the harshness surrounding her. In moments when her stepmother's cruelty seemed unbearable, or when the household's laughter threatened to crush her, the dust's unseen power steadied her, grounding her spirit in a way that physical strength could not. It reminded her that endurance is more than submission. It is the quiet assertion of one's essence against forces that seek to diminish it. As she continued to perform her daily ritual, Nia found herself whispering small prayers, seeking guidance and expressing gratitude to the mysterious presence within the dust. She felt a subtle connection growing, one that transcended fear and humiliation. It was as though the dust had become a living chronicle of her fortitude, silently preparing to amplify her spirit in ways she could not yet fully understand. The act of licking it, once degrading, now became a sacred acknowledgement of her inner strength, patience, and unwavering character. Through this newfound awareness, Nia began to perceive her suffering differently. The physical pain, the scorn, the humiliation, all became part of a greater journey. The dust, with its spiritual presence, was a witness to her courage, a hidden ally that had always been there, observing and waiting. The realization gave her hope, a quiet assurance that her endurance was not unnoticed, and that the universe, or perhaps her ancestors' spirits, had a way of recording her trials and acknowledging her unwavering heart. By embracing the dust's mysterious nature, Nia transformed her daily acts of submission into moments of empowerment. What had been designed to demean her now revealed the hidden strength within, the sacredness of patience and resilience, and the quiet power of enduring injustice with dignity. The dust was no longer merely dirt, it was an observer, a guide, and a silent testament to the courage that lived within her. As Nia continued her daily ritual of licking the dust before every meal, a subtle change began to stir in the air around her. The dust that had once seemed coarse, lifeless, and entirely indifferent to her presence now carried a faint shimmer under the sunlight that filtered through the small cracks of the courtyard. Nia noticed it at first as a fleeting glimmer, barely perceptible, like a wisp of smoke rising from the ground, but soon realized that it seemed almost to respond to her movements, shifting slightly as she knelt, bowing her head, and pressing her lips to the coarse particles. She paused one morning mid-gesture, and looked closely at the dust, feeling an inexplicable warmth spread through her chest. Though she had been taught to view her submission as shame, a strange reverence began to bloom in her heart. The dust, Nia felt, was watching her. Not with eyes of judgment or mockery as the household often did, but with quiet attention, as though it were aware of the strength and patience she carried within her frail frame. Each grain seemed to hold memory and purpose, as though the countless footsteps, whispers, and tears of those who had knelt before it over the years had left behind a faint echo. And now, it seemed to sense the endurance and courage that flowed through Nia, responding in subtle, unseen ways. Over the days that followed, she noticed small signs that confirmed her intuition. A breeze that would usually scatter the dust now seemed to swirl around her deliberately, brushing against her hands and shoulders like a gentle caress. When she closed her eyes, she could almost feel the dust beneath her lips humming, a quiet vibration that seemed to echo in her chest. The sensation was not painful nor overwhelming, but powerful enough to awaken a deep understanding in Nia. This was no ordinary earth. The dust carried an essence, ancient and patient, waiting for her to recognize it. Curiosity and awe began to mingle with her routine of humiliation. Nia found herself lingering a moment longer before kneeling, feeling the cool grains against her fingertips, listening to the faint whispers that seemed to arise from them when the household was too busy or distracted to notice. They spoke not in words she could immediately understand, but in a rhythm of sensations, a gentle push, a light warmth, a reassuring pulse, that reminded her that her suffering was witnessed, that her patience was acknowledged, and that her endurance had meaning. This realization did not make the acts easier, nor did it lessen the cruelty of her tormentors. Each meal still began with the same act of submission, the same bitter humiliation. The household continued to mock her, sneering at her bowed posture and the ritual they had forced upon her. Yet Nia no longer felt entirely powerless. In the quiet moments, she understood that the dust was her companion, her confidant, and her silent protector. It was as if the ground itself had chosen to honor her resilience, turning what had been a tool of degradation into a witness of her strength. Nia began to notice patterns in the way the dust responded to her mood and thoughts. When despair threatened to overwhelm her, the grains would shimmer faintly as if to remind her that she was not alone. When her mind wandered to memories of her family, the kindness she had known before her hardship, the dust seemed to cradle her spirit, pulsing softly beneath her lips. And when anger or sorrow flared within her, the dust's subtle warmth seemed to absorb it, grounding her in a sense of calm determination. It was in these quiet, unobserved moments that Nia began to understand the deeper truth. The dust did not judge her for what she was forced to do, it honored her for who she was. It recognized her heart, her patience, and the courage she displayed in the face of constant degradation. Each grain became a silent ally, carrying the weight of her spirit and amplifying it in ways she could not yet fully comprehend. Even when the household laughed or sneered, Nia felt a quiet pride, knowing that the earth beneath her was bearing witness to her endurance in a way no human eyes could. By the end of the week, this awareness had transformed the act itself. Nia no longer approached it as a burden she was powerless to resist. She knelt with quiet reverence, lips pressed to the dust, and a steady heartbeat echoing in her chest. She felt the power of history, of countless generations who had walked and knelt on the same earth. She felt the presence of something ancient, wise, and protective that acknowledged her as worthy and strong. It was not just dust, it was a guardian, a companion, and a teacher. And in this realization, Nia discovered an unexpected joy. Her suffering remained, and the humiliation persisted, but her spirit no longer bowed entirely to her oppressors. The dust, in its quiet, mysterious way, had become a source of power, reminding her that even in degradation, there could be strength, even in silence, there could be a voice. The act that was meant to shame her had become a ritual of unseen recognition, a testament to the resilience of her heart, and the beginning of a transformation that would ripple far beyond the walls of her household. As the days of servitude passed, Nia's connection with the dust beneath her lips deepened. What had begun as a quiet curiosity evolved into a steady bond, a silent communion that strengthened her in ways no one in the household could perceive. While the family and villagers saw only a girl bowed low, performing acts meant to humiliate her, Nia's spirit quietly gathered power, tempered by patience and unwavering kindness. She learned to move through the endless cycles of degradation with a calm precision, treating each meal, each act of submission as a meditation rather than a punishment. In these moments, kneeling on the rough floor, her lips brushing against the coarse grains, she found clarity. The dust seemed to vibrate subtly in response to her thoughts, acknowledging the endurance she displayed and offering her solace. It became more than an inanimate witness, it was a companion, a silent teacher that reminded her of the value of quiet resilience. Every time she felt despair threaten to engulf her, the grains beneath her lips seemed to hum with a soft warmth, reassuring her that her patience was seen and honored. In this, Nia discovered a profound truth: strength was not always loud or visible. Sometimes, the most powerful resolve was hidden in silence, nurtured in moments of solitude, and forged in the face of persistent cruelty. Though her body ached and her hands bore the rough calluses of constant kneeling, Nia's mind remained sharp and her spirit vigilant. She reflected on the lessons of her ancestors, the stories her grandmother had once whispered by the fire, tales of those who endured injustice with dignity and in doing so transformed their fates. The dust beneath her became a symbol of that wisdom, a repository of ancient patience and strength, carrying echoes of those who had bowed before it, silently defying the cruelty imposed upon them. Nia drew inspiration from this lineage, understanding that her endurance could ripple beyond her own suffering. Even in the face of constant scorn, Nia's heart remained kind. She resisted the urge to retaliate or harbor hatred toward her oppressors. Instead, she focused on the small gestures of empathy and care she could offer: a comforting word to a younger child in the household, a gentle hand to a struggling animal, or a silent prayer for those who had wronged her. The dust seemed to reward these acts with a gentle reinforcement, a faint, warming vibration that reminded her that her goodness had meaning, even when no human eye acknowledged it. It was in this interplay between suffering and virtue that her silent strength grew, rooted in the knowledge that endurance paired with kindness could become an invisible, yet unstoppable, force. Nia began to anticipate the rhythms of her day not with dread, but with quiet determination. She approached each humiliating task with deliberate calm, her mind focused on maintaining dignity even in the most degrading circumstances. Each act of forced submission became a practice in restraint, self-respect, and internal power. She no longer saw the dust merely as something to be licked, but as a mirror reflecting her perseverance, each grain absorbing her resolve and amplifying it in ways that no one could witness. The household continued to mock her, unaware that their attempts to diminish her only strengthened her resolve. The more they sneered, the more Nia rooted herself in the knowledge that her spirit remained untouched. While her body submitted, her soul soared, fortified by the unseen, protective presence beneath her. Each humiliation became an opportunity to cultivate inner mastery, to transform her pain into a reservoir of unyielding power. She understood, with increasing certainty, that one day her endurance would matter, that the patience, kindness, and dignity she displayed now could spark change far greater than the cruelty she suffered. Evenings brought long stretches of solitude where Nia could reflect deeply on her circumstances. She imagined the village and household beyond her immediate surroundings, seeing how the chains of envy, fear and prejudice had shaped the lives of all who dwelled there. She prayed silently that her strength, grounded in compassion, could alter not only her destiny but also the hearts of those around her. In these contemplative moments she felt the dust's warmth deepen, an almost imperceptible glow beneath her fingers and lips, encouraging her to maintain hope. Hope became her quiet rebellion. She nurtured a vision of a future where cruelty would not dominate the household, where respect and empathy could replace oppression, and where even those who had wronged her might learn humility. The dust, in its mysterious way, seemed to share in this vision, offering her a sense of purpose and connection to forces beyond her understanding. Nia realized that her silent strength was more than a personal shield. It was a seed, planted in the fertile soil of patience and virtue, that might one day bear fruit visible to the world. By embracing her suffering as a form of training rather than defeat, Nia began to transcend the limitations imposed upon her. She discovered that true power did not always manifest in grand gestures or overt displays but in the quiet mastery of one's inner life. With every meal, every act of forced humility, she honed this power, anchored in kindness, patience and unwavering hope. Even as the household attempted to crush her spirit, she remained unbroken, walking the invisible path laid out by generations before her, guided by the dust that bore witness to her growing, silent strength. The morning broke like any other, with the first pale light spilling over the earthen floors of the household, dust motes dancing in the sunbeams as if rehearsing for some unseen performance. Nia rose with the habitual weight in her limbs and the familiar ache in her knees, the muscles stiff from years of submission. Her heart carried its usual mix of dread and quiet determination, for she knew what awaited her at every meal. Today she would kneel, bend, and bring her lips to the dust once again, enduring the humiliation imposed upon her with the patience she had cultivated over countless days. Yet as she approached the floor with her ritualistic movements, a strange sensation halted her mid-step. The grains of dust, so familiar in their texture, seemed to stir beneath her gaze. It was subtle at first, a faint tremor, almost like a whisper, but unmistakable. The once inert particles shimmered faintly as though aware of her presence. Nia paused, her brow furrowed in confusion, and bent closer, running a careful fingertip across the surface. The dust resisted her touch. It quivered beneath her fingers, pulling back slightly as if refusing her descent. Nia's pulse quickened, a mixture of astonishment and a hint of fear prickling through her veins. She knelt fully, expecting to press her lips to the familiar surface, yet the dust seemed to shift, forming an almost imperceptible barrier. Her lips hovered above the grains, and no matter how gently she pressed, the dust did not yield. It was as though some unseen force was guiding it, asserting its will, and interrupting the centuries-old rhythm of subjugation. The household, oblivious to this quiet revolution, had already gathered for the morning meal. The oppressors watched, their expressions initially bored and expectant, ready to sneer and remind Nia of her place. Their eyes widened as they observed her hesitate, her lips unnaturally suspended above the dust. Whispers rippled through the room like a sudden wind. "What is she doing?" one of them hissed. Another leaned forward, voice dripping with venom. "Go on. Kneel. Lick it." But Nia could not. And as much as the human voice demanded compliance, the dust itself refused. It formed a subtle, almost liquid-like layer that cushioned her knees and lips, preventing her from completing the act of submission. In that instant, a powerful understanding filled her mind. She was no longer alone in this ritual of humiliation. The silent observer, the companion that had grown alongside her over the years, had taken a stand. The very dust that had witnessed decades of degradation was now her ally, protecting her dignity and asserting that she was no longer a passive participant. Shock rippled across the faces of her oppressors. For the first time their authority faltered. One of them lunged forward, grabbing her arm with a harsh grip, attempting to push her down. Nia resisted, her own strength surprising her, reinforced by the uncanny support of the dust beneath her. It was as though each particle had imbued her with a fraction of the courage it had observed in her silent endurance. The oppressors stumbled backward in disbelief, the balance of power shifting in the smallest, most extraordinary of ways. Nia's mind raced. Questions of morality, justice, and destiny mingled with awe and gratitude. Could it be that the very dust she had been forced to lick, the instrument of her humiliation, had been waiting for this precise moment to reveal its true power? Could something as humble, as ordinary as the dust beneath her have watched her suffering and decided that enough was enough? Her heart swelled with a combination of relief and righteous determination. Today was no longer a day of subjugation, it was a day of revelation. The crowd of onlookers grew restless. Whispers turned to murmurs, murmurs to sharp exclamations. "The dust, it moves," one voice cried. "It refuses her," another gasped. Some stepped closer, craning their necks to understand the inexplicable phenomenon, while others recoiled in fear, unsure of what they were witnessing. Nia could feel their eyes on her, heavy with a mixture of disbelief, suspicion, and in some rare instances admiration. The same dust that had served as a symbol of oppression was now a testament to unseen justice, a witness turned defender. Her oppressors attempted to assert control through intimidation. One banged a fist against the table, shouting, "Kneel! Show respect." Yet every command fell flat. The dust resisted, shimmering with a subtle defiance that neither insults nor threats could overcome. Nia felt a calm determination settle over her. She realized that the humiliation they had wielded as a weapon for years had been transformed into a source of empowerment. Their cruelty could no longer dictate her actions, for a force older and wiser than human malice had intervened. The villagers who had gathered outside to observe the morning rituals began to notice the commotion within the household. Rumors spread rapidly, carried by the wind, through the narrow lanes and dusty courtyards. Whispers reached ears that had never given Nia more than disdainful glances. "She stands with the earth itself," one elder murmured, voice tinged with awe. "Perhaps the spirits themselves have chosen her," said another, wary of crossing unseen boundaries. What was meant to be a simple demonstration of dominance had become an extraordinary spectacle, a miracle in the making. Nia's thoughts wandered briefly to the generations before her, the ancestors who had quietly endured oppression and injustice. She felt the weight of their unspoken stories and the legacy of resilience they had left behind. The dust, her silent companion, had become the vessel through which their strength manifested. Each refusal of the grains beneath her lips was a refusal on behalf of every soul who had suffered, a quiet rebellion that transcended her own body and existence. By midday, the initial shock began to solidify into a collective recognition of change. Even those who had once reveled in her humiliation now hesitated, unsure of how to respond. The dust remained unwavering, a silent, almost mystical shield. Nia understood that this was no mere accident. The culmination of her years of endurance and quiet strength had summoned this moment. Her humiliation had been transformed into empowerment, the mundane into the miraculous, and the ordinary dust into a conduit of justice and respect. As the ceremony continued, Nia remained kneeling, not out of submission, but in a poised, deliberate stance that symbolized the new balance of power. The air in the household felt charged, each breath carrying a weight of expectation and awe. Nia's oppressors, for all their arrogance, could not bend her spirit, nor could they force the dust to betray her. And as she looked out over the assembly, she saw not only astonishment but the first glimmers of admiration, even hope, flickering in the eyes of those who had once mocked her. In that moment, Nia realized the magnitude of her transformation. She had passed beyond mere survival. She had reached a state where patience, kindness, and unwavering endurance could command respect, even from the elements themselves. The dust's refusal to yield was more than a magical act. It was a message to the world. Humiliation could no longer dominate her, for the universe, quiet, patient, and infinitely observant, had taken her side. The moment stretched, charged with tension, as the household realized that their control over Nia had slipped like sand through their fingers. The dust, once a passive witness to their cruelty, now acted with a will of its own, resisting her kneeling and disrupting their carefully maintained hierarchy. Murmurs rose like waves in a storm, small at first, then swelling into an audible hum of disbelief. The oppressors' faces twisted with confusion, their eyes darting back and forth as if expecting some hidden accomplice to emerge from the shadows, explaining this impossibility. The first to react was Maro, the harshest of Nia's tormentors. His hands clenched into fists, knuckles whitening as he barked, "What is this? Get down. Obey me." His voice, usually commanding and unyielding, faltered under the weight of the impossible. He stepped forward, attempting to push her down by force, but the dust shifted beneath her, almost repelling his touch. His fingers brushed the surface and a slight tremor coursed through him, causing him to stagger back, cursing under his breath. The others in the room froze, their arrogance replaced by a creeping, undeniable fear. Hers was not the only defiance they faced. The household servants, who had long been conditioned to mimic their master's cruelty, now looked on with wide, uncertain eyes. Some whispered nervously to each other, "Did you see it? The dust, it won't let her kneel." Their voices carried equal parts awe and terror, as if the rules of the world had shifted in a single incomprehensible moment. A few crossed themselves, muttering prayers to ward off evil, while others stepped back instinctively, fearful of being touched by the mysterious force. Maro's second-in-command, a woman named Selma, attempted to regain control by snapping orders, her tone sharp and commanding. "Nia, you will obey. On your knees." But her words were hollow. The dust seemed to resist her authority as well, rising slightly beneath her gaze, swirling faintly around Nia's knees in a subtle, almost mocking display. The air in the room thickened, carrying with it the unmistakable weight of the unnatural. Selma's face drained of color, and she glanced toward Maro, her confidence unraveling. The plan they had carefully orchestrated for weeks, the humiliation, the domination, was crumbling before their eyes. The household elders who had sanctioned Nia's endless acts of submission now found themselves at a loss. They had long believed that authority rested in their ability to instill fear, to crush those who dared oppose them. Yet here was a power they could not comprehend, a quiet but unyielding resistance that no whip, scolding, or punishment could overcome. One elder muttered almost to himself, It cannot be human. No child could stand against us and have the dust itself rise in her defense." His voice was trembling, and the room fell into an uneasy silence. Nia remained still, her expression serene, yet beneath the calm lay the deep, quiet satisfaction of vindication. Each flicker of the dust's movement beneath her knees affirmed that her years of endurance had not been in vain. She could feel the shift in energy, the subtle power that pulsed through her, amplified by the elements themselves. The oppressor's panic fed into her sense of empowerment, though she did not gloat. Instead, she stood firm, a figure of composed strength, while the household crumbled around her, bewildered and frightened. The murmurs spread quickly beyond the immediate room, reaching the ears of those who had never cared for Nia, who had long dismissed her as meek and insignificant. Servants, children, and even distant neighbors who happened to witness the unusual commotion, gasped and whispered among themselves. "It is not of this world," one said in hushed tones. "Perhaps she carries a spirit's blessing," another suggested. Rumors began to flow like water from a breached dam, each retelling growing more vivid, more fantastical, yet all rooted in the undeniable sight of dust refusing to yield to human cruelty. Fear, pure and untempered, rippled through the oppressors. Maro's hands shook as he tried to maintain a semblance of authority, yet every attempt to command Nia was met with subtle defiance from the ground itself. His face turned a pale shade, almost gray, and sweat formed at his hairline. He looked around at the gathered household members, expecting to find a conspirator, a hidden accomplice, someone to blame. But the truth was impossible to ignore. The resistance came not from another human, but from the dust beneath her, a force that had silently observed her suffering and now chose to intervene. Selma, desperate to regain control, tried intimidation by stepping closer to Nia, her voice louder, harsher. "Do you think you are some spirit child, cursed or blessed? Kneel." Her command was met with nothing but the undulating dust and the calm defiance in Nia's eyes. A shiver ran through the room, as though the very walls had absorbed the tension and reflected it back at the terrified household. Whispers of curses, spirits, and divine intervention circulated rapidly, making each household member second-guess their authority and the very foundation of their beliefs. By mid-morning, the panic had escalated into chaos. Some tried to physically remove Nia, others sought to flee the room in fear of unseen consequences. The dust continued its subtle but undeniable rebellion, a quiet sentinel that mirrored Nia's resolve. The room had become a theater of supernatural tension, and every observer felt the weight of a power they could neither measure nor control. In that moment, Nia understood something profound. Her endurance, her patience, her refusal to break under years of oppression had awakened something ancient, a force that recognized righteousness and justice. The household, once an instrument of her suffering, had become a testament to the consequences of cruelty, now manifesting in a way both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Their panic was the first acknowledgement that humiliation and oppression could not prevail over resilience, and that patience and virtue could awaken powers unseen, yet ever present. By the time the elders regained their composure, they were forever changed. The fear in their eyes reflected not only the immediate threat of the mysterious dust but the realization that their authority had limits, and that true power could emerge from even the most humble and oppressed. Nia, still kneeling with quiet dignity, had transformed the room, the household, and their understanding of control and justice. The whispers grew into a hum of cautious reverence. a mixture of fear and awe that would long linger in the minds of those who had witnessed the dust's refusal. The household, once confident in its cruelty, now knew that some forces, quiet, patient, and unseen, could not be commanded, could not be suppressed, and could not be broken. Nia sat quietly in the corner of the courtyard after the chaos had subsided, her knees still dust-streaked, her palms resting lightly against the earth. The sun had begun its slow climb, casting long golden shadows across the uneven stones and mud of the household grounds. Birds chirped nervously, disturbed perhaps by the previous day's disturbances, and even the wind seemed hesitant, brushing softly through the trees as if wary of intruding on a moment of quiet reflection. Nia's heart was still racing from the events that had unfolded, the dust's refusal to obey her, the fear in the oppressor's eyes, the whispered murmurs of spirits and curses. She had survived humiliation countless times, yet never had she witnessed her endurance manifest in such a tangible, almost sentient way. Her mind wandered through the day's events, replaying each moment with a mixture of astonishment and unease. The dust had shifted beneath her knees as she had approached it, refusing her ritual of submission. It was not a subtle resistance. It was deliberate, almost purposeful, as though the earth itself had grown sentient and recognized her suffering. Nia could feel that same gentle yet undeniable presence now, resting just beneath the surface of her awareness. She leaned forward slightly, letting her fingertips graze the scattered dust still clinging to her skirt, and wondered, was this power a blessing or was it something else entirely? She thought of her grandmother, who had often whispered tales of spirits that observed the hearts of humans, that judged the meek and the cruel alike, that could act in moments of great injustice. Perhaps it was the same force now at work. Nia's mind wrestled with questions that she had never allowed herself to consider before. How long had this power been watching her? Was it awakened by her suffering, her patience, or some innate quality within her that even she had yet to understand? And most importantly, could she trust it? For a long moment she closed her eyes, breathing deeply, trying to listen beyond the wind, beyond the faint murmurs of the household and village. There was a rhythm to it, a subtle pulse that seemed to resonate with her own heartbeat. Nia felt her chest tighten with awe and caution. The sensation was like a whisper of warmth and strength flowing into her, yet mingled with it was a shadow of responsibility. She understood, in a way she could not fully articulate, that this force was not merely a tool to punish her oppressors. It was a living power, one that required understanding, care, and wisdom. Nia's thoughts returned to the events themselves. The dust had not attacked anyone violently, nor had it sought revenge. It had simply refused, creating discomfort and panic for those who had sought to degrade her. She realized that the power did not serve her whims or desires, it served justice in its purest form. That realization filled her with both reverence and trepidation. If she misused it or failed to respect it, what consequences might arise? Could the same force turn against her, or against those she cared for? Her reflection deepened as she considered the implications of living with such an unseen ally. How would her life change if others discovered the truth? The villagers were already whispering, their fear and awe palpable even from a distance. Would they approach her with reverence, or would envy and suspicion grow, replacing the subtle cruelty she had long endured? Nia realized that this power, while protective, also set her apart in ways that could be dangerous. She needed to understand it, to temper it with patience and humility, just as she had tempered her own endurance for so many years. Nia's gaze fell upon the scattered dust around her, each grain catching the sunlight like tiny sparks of hidden fire. She reached down, allowing a single handful to fall through her fingers, observing how it responded almost imperceptibly to her touch. It shifted, settling in soft, deliberate patterns as if acknowledging her presence. The thought struck her profoundly. Perhaps this force had been waiting for her all along, observing, measuring her resilience, her patience, her ability to endure cruelty without bitterness. And perhaps it had chosen this moment not for spectacle or revenge, but to awaken her to a truth that had always been there, that suffering, when met with dignity, could become a source of unassailable strength. She paused, contemplating the years she had spent in servitude, each day of licking dust, each insult and scorn, each ache and hunger. None of it had been wasted. All those experiences had shaped her into someone who could coexist with this strange living power, someone who could act not out of vengeance but with purpose and justice. Her mind began to formulate possibilities, ways to channel this energy thoughtfully, to protect herself, and perhaps even guide others away from cruelty. She could feel its presence respond to her intent, subtle yet unmistakable, as if affirming her resolve. Nia also reflected on the nature of fear. The household had been terrified not because they understood magic, but because they recognized the consequences of cruelty. The dust's refusal had forced them to confront the imbalance they had created, and they had done so without a word spoken by her. This insight resonated deeply. Power, she realized, could exist quietly without aggression and still compel justice. The challenge would be to maintain that balance, to ensure that her actions remained guided by wisdom rather than impulse. As the day wore on, Nia rose slowly, brushing the dust from her knees. Her movements were deliberate, calm, and unhurried, a silent testament to the lessons she had gleaned from the day's extraordinary events. She felt a quiet harmony with the world around her, an awareness that the unseen force would continue to watch, to protect, and to guide, but only if she remained true to the principles that had earned its attention. With every cautious step, she began to embrace the responsibility, recognizing that her path forward was intertwined with something greater than herself, a living, breathing testament to endurance, virtue, and the quiet, transformative power of patience. For the first time in her life, Nia allowed herself a small, private smile. She had survived. She had endured. And now, in partnership with a force both mysterious and righteous, she was ready to face whatever came next with courage, wisdom, and an unshakable sense of purpose. The next morning, a tense silence filled the household as Nia prepared for what had become a ritual of humiliation. Her knees brushed against the familiar dust, and she lowered herself, expecting once again to perform the degrading act that had marked her daily life for so long. But this morning was different. The air felt charged, heavy with anticipation, and even the sunlight that poured through the windows seemed to hesitate before touching the ground. Nia's oppressors, 3 members of the household who had long taken pleasure in her suffering, approached with the same arrogance they had shown countless times before. Their eyes glittered with expectation, cruelty firmly etched on every line of their faces. "Get on your knees, Nia," barked the eldest of them, a woman whose sharp tongue and biting words had haunted Nia since her first day in the household. "You will do as you are told or face the consequences." Nia's heart beat steadily, not with fear, but with a quiet confidence that had been growing inside her for days. She lowered herself slightly, but the dust beneath her knees resisted. It shifted, forming small ridges and uneven clumps, almost as if it had a will of its own. Her oppressors noticed immediately and exchanged uneasy glances. "What trickery is this?" one of them hissed, attempting to push her down by force. But the dust seemed to harden, creating a subtle barrier that made it impossible to kneel fully. Nia felt the strange protective force pulse beneath her palms, a reminder that she was no longer alone in her suffering. "You will obey," another demanded, stepping forward aggressively. She reached for Nia's shoulders, intending to force her down, but each time she tried, the dust shifted again, forming uneven patches that unbalanced her steps. She stumbled, her face flushing with anger and humiliation. The household fell into a sudden, uneasy hush. Neighbors peered through the open windows, sensing that something extraordinary was occurring. Nia's gaze remained calm, her mind clear. She had endured countless insults, hunger, and ridicule, yet never had she witnessed her endurance manifest in such a tangible way. The dust, which had once been the symbol of her subjugation, had become her ally. Each of her oppressors' attempts to assert dominance was met with subtle resistance, a gentle but undeniable force that reminded them of the balance they had disrupted. This is impossible," the eldest cried, her voice trembling. "You cannot escape what is owed." But the dust did not relent, and Nia did not resist. She remained still, composed, and dignified, letting the mysterious power beneath her knees assert the justice that human hands could not enforce. The oppressors tried every tactic, threats, shouting, even attempts to drag her forcibly, but each act only highlighted their own powerlessness. Their shouts echoed hollowly, and their faces, once proud, now showed fear and confusion. The household, which had for so long been a stage of humiliation for Nia, was now a theater of irony. The very instruments of her oppression, the dust and the rituals imposed upon her, had become the agents of her dignity. Whispers of astonishment spread among the servants and visiting villagers, who had never before witnessed a force so visibly respond to virtue and endurance. Some muttered about ancestral blessings, while others murmured of spirits watching over the innocent. Nia felt the protective energy of the dust flow through her, but she did not let it dictate her actions beyond maintaining her balance and composure. She lowered her head, not in submission but in quiet dignity, allowing her oppressors to see the truth reflected in her calm eyes. She had endured, and she would not be broken. "Enough!" one of them finally shouted, nearly in tears, their voice cracking under the strain of anger and fear. They stumbled back, realizing that they had no control over her, and worse, that the source of power resisting them was beyond their understanding. The dust beneath Nia had become an unyielding force, not through violence, but through the weight of justice and endurance. In that moment, the household experienced a profound reversal of roles. Those who had long lorded over Nia's life found themselves humbled before her quiet strength. They looked at her with a mixture of awe, fear, and shame, understanding for the first time that cruelty could be met not with retaliation, but with patience and integrity, and that such patience could summon its own, extraordinary form of power. Nia rose slowly, brushing the dust lightly from her knees. Her movements were deliberate and calm, radiating an unshakable dignity that no amount of humiliation could diminish. The oppressors could only watch, their faces pale, as the quiet authority of virtue asserted itself in a way they had never imagined. The household, once a place of mockery and scorn, now recognized her in a different light. Her endurance, patience, and inherent kindness had transformed the very ground beneath her, and in doing so, humbled those who had sought to dominate her. By the end of the day, Nia's oppressors had retreated, their arrogance broken, their schemes thwarted not by violence or cunning, but by a force far greater than their understanding. Nia, standing amidst the dust that had once been her instrument of shame, realized the profound truth she had been shown. Patience, dignity, and resilience could summon a power beyond the reach of cruelty, and that even the humblest and most oppressed could command respect through virtue alone. The villagers who witnessed the confrontation spread word of the event, sharing stories of a young girl who had faced daily humiliation, only to be protected and elevated by the very dust they had believed powerless. Nia, now both quiet and unshakable, had become a symbol of hope and justice, her story destined to be remembered for generations as the day the dust refused to let cruelty prevail.